Before I start, I want to say that next week is a week you don't want to miss. We have, the teens are doing the Sunday service kind of from beginning to end. And I want to read you something that I read last night. Some of you know Howard Gardner is a world-famous educator, and let me just read this to you. The researchers found that up to age 4, almost all the children are at genius level in terms of the multiple frames of intelligence that Gardner talks about: spatial, kinetic, musical, interpersonal, mathematical, extrapersonal, and linguistic. By the age 20, the percentage of children at genius level was down to 10%. And over 20, the genius level proportion of subjects sank to 2%. Doesn't speak well for us here, does it? Really? But we should look forward to the kids speaking at genius level for the whole service. Right? Anyway, get ready for that. It should be really fun. I think we have such an amazing group of teens this year that we decided just to give them the whole thing to play for. So that'll be fun. I want to talk about community today. Let me start off by saying this. I think the biggest deficit that that the country as a whole might be described as a lack of community. Certainly lack of seeing the world as our community, or seeing this country as our community, or even seeing people in our state who vote differently than us as our community. I think it's a real problem. Now, before I go too far into the advocating community, I want to say there's a reason why we have moved away from it in the first place, or why we started the journey away from it. I think the rate of change that happens when you have an individualistic society is faster than the rate of change in a traditional society. Traditional societies, basically, that all the norms are determined by the community, by the group, and you stay within that or you're ostracized. And ostracization or being burned, I don't know if you know this, but the word fired comes from this practice in Europe that if they didn't like you in the community, they burned your house down, and therefore you were fired. And so that's a tough world to live in if you don't fit in, right? And there's a lot of conformity, and therefore a lot of rigidity, and the rigidity led to a lack of innovation. And we chose, as a Western societies, innovation over this consistency. And it has led to an enormous financial and technological explosion of good things. However, the major cost has been community. And the community is sort of like the root system of the individual. It's like a plant without roots begins to be less strong, less tolerant to change, etc. And that's where we have found ourselves today. And so the corrective is to add more community back to make up for what we have given up so freely and moved on. As most of you know, many of you are not from this area. We're not born in Raleigh. How many people were born in Raleigh? Right? So the chances of you having a built-in community are pretty slim, right? How many, just for the sake of fun, are from New Jersey? Well, probably less than the national average, but less than the Raleigh average. But we're just we're people who moved from someplace else, right? And therefore, what would naturally form as a community around us, we have to recreate on purpose. So, one of the ways of doing that, obviously, is to join a church. One of the best ways to do that is to join a church. And I think this community here is as exemplar as a community. And if you had to look at no further than the people dressed in white today, it's just an amazing, amazing community. People who would dedicate themselves to praying for you so that you might have a deeper experience of health and happiness and wealth, and also that they might have the depth that comes from being a giver. Of course, being a giver is a big piece of being in a community. If you don't give into it, pretty soon you're fired, right? You've got to be a contributor at some point. And they're doing it. And I want to say one of the things that they did this weekend was they formed a tighter community within this community by going on retreat with each other and praying with each other. Now, for those of you who've ever done praying with others, or which we gave everybody a chance in the Power of 8 groups, if you've done that, you realize that the depth that comes from that activity is quite profound. So you get 16 people locked in a cabin for 2.5 days, they become quite close. And I'm hoping that one of the things that happens out of their community is it becomes a community that doesn't focus on in-group, out-group. But this particular community is focused on in-group and inclusion through prayer, which makes it relatively different than most groups, most communities. So I have a theory that's sort of like the children's intelligent theory, that we step down in our ability to be in community as we get older. That we start off kind of open as children, at the genius level of community. We play with almost everybody, we like almost everybody. It's easy for us. We don't want anybody to be hurt, we don't want anybody to be sad, we want everybody to be included. It's an open, a childlike way of being. We're open up here, but then it steps down as we go through major or minor traumas in our life, and we have let's say a bully in kindergarten, and he steps down, and then we go into high school, and it steps down, and then if you can't say "oh my God" in the right way, you're excluded, so it steps down, and everybody steps down into a tighter and tighter package. And finally, as an adult now, we watch NBC or MSNBC or Fox, and we go, everybody who's not watching this channel is a jerk, right? And we have tightened a lot in who's acceptable. And this, I think, has become a disease level, epidemic. In this country, it's an epidemic of great proportion that we do not have a country as our community. We have our political affiliation or some other smaller affiliation as our group. And this is quite problematic. And it has caused the dysfunction that we see in Washington, D.C., which is only emblematic of the country. It might be a very bad example, but it is not others that are doing it. It is we who have bought into that system. And that's why they are our representatives. And so they represent the framework from which they were elected. And that is on us. Now, lately, there's been a lot of discussion about the Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And what did they do to meddle in our election? They pitted us against each other by sending particular forms of influential emails or Facebooks or fake news stories or real news stories targeted to particular people known to get them to become hardened in their isolation against the other, and then they did the opposite stories to other people, and so that we would polarize. A country like ours, you cannot defeat from outside, but we could defeat ourselves. We can take ourselves down. No one can beat us on the other side, from the outside in. And so we have shown them how best to weaken us. Here's the best way to weaken us. Foment dislike of one group against another. And they were good at it, I guess. But we already knew how to do it ourselves. We've been practicing for quite some time now. It has become the politic of this nation to act in that way. On the big scale, now let's take a brand down to the lower scale. People driving in cars have road rage. I don't think it happens as often on sidewalks, that you step in front of someone and they shoot you. I don't think it happens as often, maybe because we drive more than we walk these days, but I think largely because they can't see your face. They can't see your face, or you can't see their face. And so it becomes an outrageous thing that they did to you. You can't see the humanity in the car. You can only see this affront. And it feels personal. And we take it personally, although what are the odds it's personal? They can't see your face. They don't know it's you. Just do the math on that. Take a second. They can't see who you are, so why is it personal? It's irritating, yes. It's dangerous, maybe, but it's not personal. And this is, again, because we don't see all drivers as in the club with us. They are those drivers, and there's us. So we have stepped it down. We're no longer genius level. We're pretty stupid about it. But we are here to get smarter. And I think the way to get smarter is to do what Goethe, Goethe, I think, Goethe. Anyway, Goethe, the famous poet, scientist, basically his method, when he came to a plant he wanted to get to know, is he would study this plant and he would just sit with it and focus on it. And it said that he would take one leaf and try to build a mental image of this leaf in his mind. He would get it down to as close a detail as he could, looking at all the nuances of that leaf, and then he would go to another leaf. And then he would go to another leaf. And in so doing, he would begin to get the morphic field idea of what this plant was at its core, not what it was in its individuality. I don't know if this makes sense or not, but it was kind of like by integrating the particular and very exacting particular parts of this plant, he began to get a much deeper feel for what the plant really was about, or what the field that let the plant unfold in. I don't mean like the field land, I mean like the energetic field, that field that creates the plant. He got beneath the surface and saw the universality of what forms that plant, and that was part of his genius. And I dare say that it's part of our genius too when we actually look deeply at someone that's in the other category and actually get to know them beneath the surface that we see at first, but we really get to know them. And if it is several people in that other category of a certain type, then you begin to see that your otherness is being reformed and shattered, essentially, by seeing that they are not like that. They're not like that. There's more there. Surely they may have the characteristics that you have noticed on the surface, but deeper, underneath it, there is this humanity, this oneness that we are part of. And it comes through concentration on the particulars and trying to get inside, as the old American Indian saying goes, inside their moccasins for long enough to know what it's like to be them. So the power of imagination can be quite useful here, is to investigate what it's like to be the other. Who is the other in your life? Jesus' great phrase, someone said, oh, Jesus, I see, love your neighbor as yourself. Great. So who's my neighbor? The smart guy that's always in the room wants to trip up the leader. You know who you are. And Jesus tells this story. So a man is walking from Jerusalem to the capital of Judea to the capital of Samaria, the Samaritans, and on the way he gets robbed, and everybody that passes on the other side. Now, Jews thought Samaritans were other, badly. They really didn't like them. They were kind of apostates to the true religion that was formed around the temple in Jerusalem, and they thought all these, what are also Jews that live north of there, are bad Jews. And therefore they were, relatives that go bad are worse than anybody, right? So they really didn't like them. They didn't think much of them. And so Jesus says, so they all passed the minister and the tax, all these people just passed by him. And then this Samaritan came and took care of this guy, took him to the hotel, paid his bill, left some money so that he might have extended care at the hotel, and says, if there's even more than that, I'll take care of it when I get done. He says, now, which of these two people do you think is this guy's neighbor? The one who walked by him or the one who took care of him? Well, he had him then, right? That was the end of that story. You and I have a tendency to see other and to, in one way or another, put them on the other side of the road and not on our side. Now, this is natural, especially since we have lost our genius. But to reclaim our genius, we come back into the flower, into the plant, and we look more deeply so that we can see the morphic field that causes all of us to be human and to have our own desires and needs and to go more clearly into understanding who we're looking at or who we're refusing to look at, and bring them into an understanding inside us by putting the mental equivalent of them inside our heads, and then we can actually see who they are. And from there, they have ceased to be completely other, and maybe now they're on our team. Maybe they are us and become us again. Another way to do it, another way to break down these walls that we have built up, this reduction of our ability to see others as ourselves, is to go into depth of meditation. Now, in the stillness of meditation, sometimes, especially if it's your intent, you can begin to see the filters with which you look upon the world. And the problem with filters, which we all have, is that we can't see past them to see the reality that is out there. We can only see through the lens darkly. You can only see what you're willing to let through. And typically the mind won't even register things it's not expecting to see. So it can be right in front of you, but you will not see it because our filters are holding it at bay from our minds. And if it does get in, it becomes quite confusing. It becomes disturbing. Now, there was a writer, when I was in college, they handed out this book like it was crack, and you had to read it, but it never took, and so I never got addicted to this idea, but the idea was a paradigm shift. The author's name was Kuhn, and he wrote this seminal book on paradigm shift. And I had no idea what they were. I mean, you read it, you got the words down, and it's like, I could pass the test, but what was he really saying? Is that when you have a paradigm shift, your world collapses. It's not a minor thing, it's a major thing. You might have revelations, but a paradigm shift is huge. So the classic one is to say that we thought the world was flat at one point, and then somebody sails around it, and we go, oh, no, it's round. Well, that's a paradigm shift. You don't fall off the edge. That the world is actually round, and the whole thing is connected in one continuous circle. That's wild. We don't think anything of it now because we have made that paradigm shift. But if I was to tell you that, what would surprise you these days? I mean, that you could fly and always could, and people started flying, getting up out of their chairs, and just flew up to the balcony. That would be a paradigm shift, right? But that's what we're talking about here, is taking this practice of self and other and replacing it with another way of being. It's huge. It's not a little thing. It's not something you're going to do in a weekend workshop. It's probably, for us, ossified beings, a lifetime practice. But if we do not make this shift and help begin this to happen, we're going to begin to enculturate the next generation into the idiocy that we have developed. And we will have a fractured nation, fractured families, and communities that become less functional rather than more. Our job as the elders in this world, and we may not be that old, but we're older than the people who will be speaking to us next week, is to set the conditions for their success in breaking through this paradigm. So as Steve Jobs once asked, what about all those people who won't buy computers? They'll die, was his answer. The people who won't buy computers, won't be a part of the information age, will ultimately die, and they will no longer block the next generation from achieving this worldwide web, et cetera, et cetera. They'll just be out of the way. But think how wonderful it is for those who do embrace it, who have already been trained in otherness, to set the conditions for the next generation to become something that we will only approximate because of our inward paradigm that controls the way we see the world. It blocks us from seeing universality. Now, it could be that this community takes this on in full force. It takes on the idea that not everybody who comes in this community has to believe the same way I do, or look the same way I do, or come from the same background, or have the same metaphysical understanding of the Bible. That we don't really need that to be true. Because what we're actually practicing is something deeper than that, which is seeing beyond the surface and going like Goethe into the nature of the person that we're talking to in front of us so deeply that it becomes impossible for us not to see our universality in it. This could be part of the reason for being in a community like this. That this community becomes a community like the prayer chaplains, which knows itself as community and takes care of itself within the borders, but its whole purpose is to extend the borders outward so that there are fewer or weaker borders. That there is no other. And that we learn to do that at such depth that we become different fundamentally as human beings. I think one of the things that will happen if that becomes our quest is that this idea of you are God will become so obvious it isn't even funny. That the practice of seeing other as self is the practice of being God. And that practice will take us on our spiritual journey in a way that we could never go if we don't. So that's my hope, that we'll be on this. We may not be perfect at it. Our tendencies may never change. We may have to use overriding our habits. We may have to override our habits to be the person we want to be. But in so doing, it will become easier and easier, and we will become a great example, even as we might be the great exception. That's my hope. Let us pray. There's a story of a man, a Jamaican man who worked for the World Bank, and he was diagnosed as having an incurable disease, and he had only months to live. And in telling that story, he said, when I got the diagnosis, I stopped doing almost everything I was doing. I said no to everything except that which I really, truly wanted to do. So I did my projects with my children. I stopped arguing with my mother. And then, after a few months, the doctors in another clinic said, I think you have a curable disease, not an incurable disease. And he was very afraid that he would go back to being the way he was before. Less excited about living and more worried about becoming his own self. Perhaps we all need to know that we might die pretty soon. The hour is not known, but inevitability is part of it. Let us think what we would be if we knew we had months to live. What would we stop doing immediately? And what would we become? This is what life is calling us to. To wake up to who we really are. To not waste time with silly things. Whether it be an argument you cannot win, a hatred of another, a fear of saying your truth. Let us step up. And as part of that, I think we all could use a good dose of friends and community. This is a beautiful place. We have a chance to express our beauty here in ways that perhaps are not always found. So let us do it with gusto. And so it is.